Um, good, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. How many were here just a couple hours ago for Frank Bruni? Oh, we got quite a few. Yeah, we should have just labeled this like New York Times Columnist Day or something. Maureen Dowd was also at the last event taking pictures. So, I mean, we've had a whole bunch of them. But it's really a great pleasure to welcome another New York Times columnist here, Nick Kristof. And of course, he's got a wonderful memoir out, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, that he's here to talk about. You know, Nick has, he's had truly a storied career in journalism since he joined the New York Times a mere 40 years ago. He's reported from Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He did a stint as an associate managing editor responsible for the Sunday editions. And then in 2001, he began writing his column. His journalism has stood out for, among other things, its frequent focus on issues of global health, poverty, and gender in the developing world, and also, you know, for the way he combines analysis with empathy. You know, time and again, Nick has highlighted in his work the human rights abuses and social injustices, both here in the United States and abroad. His 5 previous books, too, all co-written with his wife, Cheryl Wooden, who's also a journalist. Those books have built on the same reporting. They've dealt with such subjects as China and Asia on the rise, the oppression of women around the world, the transformational impact altruism can have, and the struggles of America's working poor. Nick and Cheryl won a Pulitzer 3.5 decades ago for their coverage of the mass movement for democracy in China and its subsequent suppression, and Nick won again in 2006 for his pieces on genocide in Darfur. A few years ago, back in 2021, Nick stepped away from journalism to make a run for governor in his home state of Oregon, but he fell short of a residency requirement, so his candidacy was ruled ineligible. But one positive result of this is that he ended up having time to start work on Chasing Hope, and also the New York Times took him back, you know, so we can still enjoy and learn from his columns. You know, given Nick's very eventful and purposeful career, it's no surprise that his memoir reads like a remarkable adventure story from rural Oregon, where he grew up, to the far reaches of the world. It chronicles the dangers, the resistance, the other challenges that he faced reporting on conflicts and genocides and poverty and warlords doing awful things, and all the rest. It's really a thrilling and inspiring read, and also paradoxically, it might seem, it's also a hopeful book, because as Nick says in the book, he regards journalism itself as an act of hope. That's the first sentence of the book, and he repeats it. And he's found, amid all the examples of the human capacity for evil, he's also found uplifting instances of human resilience and courage and strength, which I'm sure he'll be talking about in a minute. In conversation with Nick will be another veteran New York Times journalist, David Sanger. David has been with the Times since he got out of college 42 years ago. I think it's just a year or two longer than Nick. And he's also had quite an amazing, impressive run with the paper as a foreign correspondent in Tokyo and a Washington correspondent covering economics, the White House, and in recent years, national security affairs. When you see David's byline on a story, you know that you can have a lot of confidence in it. And David was here just, I think, like a month ago to promote his own new book, New Cold Wars, which looks at the reemergence in recent years of superpower conflict. It's also now a bestseller, and I encourage you to get that book if you haven't already. Anyway, please join me now in welcoming Nick and David.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you, Brad. Wonderful to be back here. It's always the same old faces, you know. Truly great to be here with my friend Nick. And that takes me to the obvious conflict of interest that is playing out in front of your eyes here. When I say that Nick and I are friends, we have been friends since we met the second week of freshman year of college, both trying to get onto the student newspaper with Jim Hirschberg, who's sitting right back here. And as you'll see as we unspool the story here, one of the contributing factors to Nick getting hired at the Times was that I had to get him the hell off of my couch in New York because he was eating all of my food, emptying out the refrigerator, and crimping my social life. So I've got a brewed up set of resentments as we discuss this terrific book, and the resentments will come through at various moments through here. When he asked me to go do this, I accepted, figuring that he wouldn't think about the risk level. Yeah.
We know each other so well and have so much dirt on each other going back more than 4 decades, going back 45 years, that we actually have a mutual non-aggression pact. And so that keeps us both safe.
And again, non-aggression pacts occasionally get violated. So anyway, Nick, this is really, jokes aside, a terrific book. And I've watched it come along the way as we were exchanging different parts of manuscripts, and Nick was trying to fact check back to things that neither of us could remember. But it's really a remarkable tale, from the plane crash at the start, which we're delighted that you survived.
Don't give things away.
Oh, sorry about that. To the story of how you met Cheryl, which I remember well because I was around those weeks. But I wanted to start actually with your dad, Ladis Kristof, who I had the wonderful privilege to get to know a little bit toward the end of his life, and who was an academic out in Oregon. He would not have had trouble with the question of residency. He was a serious Oregonian, but before that, he had this remarkable history as a refugee that clearly so affected the topics that you choose and your willingness to sort of push the rules out here a little bit. He grew up in what is now southwestern Ukraine. What I think you told me was Austria-Hungary, initially. But tell us just a little bit about your dad, because it explains so much about you.
Sure. And, thanks everybody for coming out. I think a bookstore is his pillars of civilization. And, you guys are all holding that up. So thank you. And thank you to David for doing this. And also, special congratulations to him. His book, New Cold War, is on the cover of the New York Times Sunday Book Review tomorrow. So reflecting a terrific book.
Thank you.
So my dad, his family, they were an Armenian family growing up in this area called Northern Bukovina, where the flag kept changing. it was somewhat confused family. When my uncle would call up my dad, they would speak to each other in Polish. When my aunt would call up, she would speak to my dad in Romanian. And the family had spied on the Nazis in 1943 and gotten into trouble. Then they ended up fleeing in every which direction. And my dad ended up in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia. And the key thing which I really learned more about only in writing the book was a French diplomat had intervened to save his life from the Yugoslav authorities in ways that really went beyond what that diplomat should have been doing. The diplomat ended up effectively bribing a senior Yugoslav official by giving him tuberculosis medicine for his daughter, and then in exchange didn't ask for benefits for France or for himself, but asked for help for these refugees along the lines of my father, and that got my dad out. And then my dad ended up in France, wanted to get to the U.S., and 2 French journalists helped get him that visa to the U.S. And periodically in any career as a foreign correspondent, you come across these areas that are right along the line of what you should do, and you have your ethical obligations to your newspaper, but you also have obligations to other people, and you're trying to sort out what is right and what is appropriate. And I keep thinking when I come to those situations, well, thank God that French diplomat intervened to help my dad, or otherwise I wouldn't be here. And thank God those journalists did something right at the edge of what was appropriate. And so I think that that experience that my dad went through, it shaped me not only in a sensitivity to refugees and global chaos, but also very much in a willingness to give my editors gray hairs sometimes by pushing the edge of maybe where we should be.
And we've also learned from some of your previous books, particularly your last one, that growing up in a rural area of Oregon, going to school on the bus with a group of kids who later on turned out to have pretty tough lives, also gave you this sort of rooted connection back into a degree of human suffering, not only abroad, but here in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, in recent years especially, that has deeply shaped me. And so I grew up in this little town called Yamhill, Oregon. Population back then 500, now it's about 1,000. We're 4 miles away from it. And it had been a really vibrant working class area. There were good jobs in the sawmills, in agriculture, in light manufacturing. And those jobs went away, and meth arrived, and this community just, it really disintegrated. And so the 5 kids who got on the bus right after me each morning were my friend Farland Knapp and his younger siblings. Farland then ended up dying of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother Zeelan died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother Nathan blew himself up cooking meth. Their sister Regina died of hepatitis from IV drug use, and their baby brother Keelan died during the pandemic of a overdose. And there are 5 kids gone like that, one after the other. Meanwhile, their mom is still alive in her 80s and visits their graves every day. And seeing that unfold in this community where we had always prided ourselves on, our strong rural values, and seeing the degree to which my old friends not only suffered greatly, but also, frankly, inflicted great suffering on others, left a deep impression on me. And I think that we in America, I don't think politicians or policymakers or journalists have adequately focused on the wreckage in so much of working class America. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think those were really important stories. But every 2.5 weeks, we lose more Americans from drugs, alcohol, and suicide than in 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think we have come to terms with that. I don't think we've tried hard enough to address that. And so that comes through very much when I was writing the book and thinking about all these lost lives, lost opportunities.
So, Nick, let me take people a little bit through the timeline of the book. Not enough that would impede sales here, since Brad locks the doors until they all buy copies. Uh, but so when we met, you had already done a little work for the Portland Oregonian, I think. We were competing to be cub reporters on the Crimson. Um, that's where our friendship went. But you left Harvard a year early, and you went off. We knew vaguely that you were in Poland during the uprising, when martial law was declared, which in retrospect was the beginning of the unraveling of the Soviet Union, but we didn't really know that for sure. And then I have this distinct memory of being around an old black and white TV set in our dorm room as the Gdansk shipyard stuff is happening and martial law is declared. And Dan Rather is interviewing remotely this kid who has just wandered out over the Polish border. And we're all like, this is Nick. He's supposed to be drinking with us. What was that all about?
So I just happened to take my first vacation when I was at Oxford in Poland during this democratic revolution. And martial law was declared shortly after I arrived. I had interned for the Washington Post, and so I thought, well, and at that point, telexes were cut off, phone lines were cut off, telegraph, there were no connection. So really, the only way to get information out was for people to hand carry it out. So I was in Krakow, and I dug around and found some Americans who were heading out of town. I wrote out articles and told them when they got to some place where they could to call the Washington Post, collect, and then to file these stories. And I had no idea if this worked or not. And so roamed around Poland. It was back in Oregon, the local TV station went and wanted to do a story about, those poor Kristof parents because their son is in war-torn Poland. And they were interviewing my dad and, oh, you must be so concerned about your son. And my dad was saying, oh, it's a great opportunity for him. And the correspondent was, well, but, there's martial law. He could be, and, my dad was saying, oh, but he has a chance to write articles. And, so there was generally sort of a miscommunication to some degree about these kind of episodes right from the beginning.
This is also one of the risks of traveling with Nick. I've learned how to stop doing this unless I'm in control of the travel schedule. We once drove up, we spent 2 weeks kicking around Burma and Thailand, and we sank a car in the mud, I think up to the windows, a rental car that we had no idea how to go rescue up in the middle of the Thai border, the Burmese border or something like that. So if you want a good meal in a restaurant and a nice hotel room, go find somebody else to travel with. And that theme comes through pretty clearly in the book. So after your roads and all that, you're in Beirut, you decide to run the Green Line, through all that. You wash up in New York briefly. You're broke. You're on my couch. You're not really thinking about looking for a job at that moment.
No, I was a lost puppy. I was actually headed for Tunisia to be a stringer. And then I stopped in New York, and then you introduced me to John Lee, the business editor there, and I pretended a great interest in business journalism. And lo and behold, he managed to hire me to cover business without ever establishing I didn't know a thing about business and didn't really have great interest in it.
Well, this was actually a remarkable time back in the business corner of the New York Times. Tom Friedman had just been through there. Some of you here have heard of him. Lisa Belkin, Todd Purdom. I mean, John had this incredible eye for, and we were all sitting within, and all, hitting the New York bars at the same time. But you then went out to LA for a year or two. bringing about one of those many resentments that I have. I was talking in here because you jumped the queue and was like a national correspondent while we were still all running around, writing about currency trading or something. Tell us about LA and Hong Kong.
Well, the most important thing about LA and a non-Cartesian argument for a just God is that I mean, my most important thing in LA was that I met this young woman who was working for the Wall Street Journal. So I was covering business for the New York Times. She was covering business for the Wall Street Journal, Cheryl Wooten. And so when we dated, we of course couldn't speak about anything either of us was doing. And so it was a little like a CIA KGB romance. But from Cheryl's point of view, the problem with me was that the New York Times seemed likely to send me off to West Africa to be a correspondent, or possibly to the Middle East, and she had no interest in either of those. She was planning to be off in Hong Kong the next summer. She's Chinese American. She wanted to be in Asia. And then a little bit, another month or two later, I get a call from a person in New York who says, at that point, the former clerks were very good at spying into the computer systems of the editors. And somebody called me up and said, hey, the foreign editor is writing a memo right now to the executive editor proposing that we open a bureau in Hong Kong and making you the Hong Kong correspondent. And sure enough, 3 days later, the foreign editor called me up and said, Nick, this will be a bolt from the blue, but we're thinking about opening a Hong Kong bureau and making you the Hong Kong correspondent. Would you like to do it? And I said, wow, that is a surprise. Yeah, I'll do it. And so then, that seemed indeed a sign. And so Cheryl joined me in Hong Kong, and we got married right as we moved to Beijing.
Speaking of the built-up resentments, I was out staying with Nick, I think the week that you met Cheryl, and then I got disinvited to be in the apartment. We had told him to keep an eye on the competition, but we didn't realize he was going to be that thorough about it. So then you go to Hong Kong, and suddenly you end up in Beijing in early '88. You are at the time the youngest foreign correspondent for the Times, and
until you show up as a foreign correspondent a little bit later.
Well, that was just to try to keep you, on your toes. And you end up in Beijing, and you decide to show up in Beijing, 6 months before Tiananmen Square?
Yeah, Tiananmen was something that really shaped me. You just never forget seeing a modern army open fire on protesters, on unarmed, peaceful protesters, and it just seared me. Also, frankly, at a time when democracy in this country is under threat, and there are a lot of Americans who don't seem to fully appreciate the power of democracy, it has struck me over and over in writing about democracy movements that often those who lack democracy are most value it. And in particular, I think about the democracy movement, and I had often, in writing about it, I'd been maybe a little bit scornful of some of the less educated folks, the peasants, who were supporting the democracy movement. And I was saying, well, they say they're for democracy, but they don't really understand what it is. They can't define it. And that was all true. But that night, when the troops opened fire, I was in that crowd, and they would be a cascade of shooting, and we would all cower. And the bravest people that night were these uneducated rickshaw drivers who, when there was a lull, they would drive out toward the troops and pick up the bodies of the kids who'd been killed or injured and put them on the backs of the rickshaws and drive them to the hospitals. And it was a example of courage and sacrifice that I've rarely seen equaled and never surpassed. And those guys might not have been able to defy democracy. They were willing to die for it. And I will never again be condescending toward people who are supporting democracy but lack maybe a lot of education. And it shaped me. I think that, again, a little like my dad's experience, was something that pushed me to bend some rules, and Cheryl and I were confronted quite soon with a challenge that we just wrestled over. There was a young man, a 19-year-old student at Tsinghua University, who had helped us cover the democracy movement, and then he ended up in prison. He escaped from prison, and he came to Beijing and asked for help fleeing the country. There are a lot of gray areas in journalism, but helping an escaped felon flee the country is pretty clearly beyond the line. And yet,
wouldn't stop you.
Well, I was deeply conflicted because I was afraid that if we got caught, we would be in trouble. The New York Times bureau would be closed. We would be damaging the Times, and yet, he's 19. If we didn't help him, what's going to happen to him? I also, frankly, I'm embarrassed to say it. I also worried a little bit that this was a setup. I'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison. I wondered if maybe this was some entrapment effort. And I just felt terrible for thinking that about this guy. But Cheryl and I consulted, we debated, and she had a firmer moral compass than I did. We did end up helping him. He did make it to Hong Kong. The next day I flew down to Hong Kong. He made it to the US. And it was, I say in the book that it was a profoundly unprofessional thing, but it's also something that I'm quite proud of doing. And once we got him out, then, I confessed to the Times. And because it had all worked out, they were perfectly happy and complimentary and, oh, that's great. And, if we'd been caught, I'm not sure it would have been quite such a triumph.
So after a brilliant run in Beijing, where I remember a phone call with you, I think it was the next night after Tiananmen, where we actually wondered whether the Chinese government was on the edge of collapse, and wasn't quite clear which way whether the army was going to side with the government or not. When we think about China in today's context, it's astounding we were having that conversation.
There were two lessons in journalism that I think I learned that were quite important. One goes to that we had very good sources in the Chinese leadership, but they were overwhelmingly on the liberal reformist side. And so their view was that, the reformists were going to win in that power struggle. And they did not think that soldiers would open fire and massacre people. And partly because of selection bias issues, we were not well sourced among the hardliners, among those who thought, yeah, if students protest, we should massacre them. And it really inculcated in me the importance of actually overcoming that selection bias issue and reaching out and building a good source network and people who completely disagree with you and have a completely different view of things. And the other lesson learned was also kind of a hard one. And so I was on Tiananmen Square when that happened. I knew what had happened. But almost immediately, there began to be a lot of reports that wildly exaggerated the scale of the killing and talked about Tiananmen being knee-deep in blood and tanks, rolling over tents with lots of people inside and this kind of thing. And I knew that had not happened. And the lesson that I realized was that we understand that perpetrators lie, but victims lie too. And when people have seen terrible, terrible things happening, then they exaggerate. They fight back by exaggerating and lying. And that we have to be as skeptical of victims as of perpetrators. And it's a really hard thing to do when somebody has lost family members or been shot, but to push and make sure they're telling the truth and triangulate. It's a very counterintuitive, difficult thing, but I've seen many other times since that it's absolutely essential if we want to try to figure out what happened.
So Nick, after China was over, your time there, I came back here to Washington for what I was promised would be a 3-year assignment. They lied. And you came and succeeded me in Tokyo. Couldn't be a bigger contrast between covering China and hopping over to Japan. Talk to us a little bit about the comparison.
So when we were going to Japan, I thought, oh, this is going to be great. This is, maybe the most important bilateral relationship, incredibly important country. Meanwhile, my wife thought that as a Asian American woman, she was kind of the bottom of both barrels. In fact, we were both wrong, that she was treated as a New York Times correspondent and her ethnicity and gender didn't really matter. And I grew a little bored by Japan. Everything kind of ran on time. Things worked.
The hotels were comfortable.
Not a lot of gunfire.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And so that was really when I began to travel around the world and persuaded the foreign desk that, India and Africa are really part of the Tokyo beat. And, so I began to cover global health at that time and traveled around Africa and Asia doing a two-part series about the importance of global health issues, which landed without a ripple. Nobody paid attention to it except these two people in Seattle who started a foundation and were trying to figure out where to invest their money. And so, so the Gates Foundation thought, well, maybe we should do global health. And the most important piece they ever wrote for that reason.
It's really wild, and I think gives you a sense of the it's a rare moment that you can find. You can connect up a line of coverage and actual effect on policy. And I would argue the Gates Foundation probably had as much or more effect on those lives than the U.S. government, all of our aid programs, in much of that. You came back here. You to New York. You guys had by that time 3 wonderful kids, who I adore, and I was down here. You were living up in New York. You were an editor for a little while, but suddenly you had this opportunity to go off and do the column. So talk to us about the decision to come out of the news world and go off into the world of opinion.
I mean, I loved editing, but I had always been trying to angle for a column. But the problem was that Tom Friedman had just been made a columnist covering international affairs, and that was really, what I had done the most. And it wasn't obvious how I would get a column. And then Al-Qaeda came in, and suddenly there was more interest in covering international affairs and sending a columnist off to Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that. So I was, in some sense, a beneficiary of 9/11, and I got the column because of that, and also because of newsroom dynamics. And there was we had a big feud in the newsroom at that point. The previous editor had made me the weekend editor. The new one didn't want to see me anywhere around and was willing to not only pay my salary when I moved over to the opinion side, but also pay all my expenses just to be rid of me. And so that was how I moved off into opinion. And I began the column in Afghanistan, and I think when I got the column, I thought that the power that we have in opinion journalism is the power to change minds. And one of the things I learned pretty quickly is that if I write about an issue that people have thought about, whether it's, Bush then or Trump now or Middle East or abortion or guns or whatever, we change almost nobody's mind. The people who start out agreeing with us think, that was a great column. People who start out disagreeing with us think, Kristof completely missed the point. But where we do have, I think, a real power, whether in opinion journalism or news journalism, is the ability to shape the agenda, to project, to write about an issue, to make people spill their coffee, and thereby project that issue on the agenda and make people care about it and think about it. And so more and more in my, I'd been very, very frustrated in writing about Iraq in the run-up to the Iraq War, that I thought we were headed for a terrible mess, and I just couldn't persuade anybody of that. And so, but more and more, I began to try to take this other approach of also writing about issues that I felt were neglected and thus could maybe get a little more attention to them. from sex trafficking to Darfur and other issues like that.
So one of the interesting things about your journalism along this way, and this has been a continuing conversation that Nick and I have had now for 25 or 30 years, is you don't do much of your reporting down here with policymakers, with, going in and out of the State Department or the White House, or basically all the stuff that you've dumped on me. So, so, but and there is a great advantage to that, I think, because you are able to go write about the effects of our policies on real live people. But tell us a little bit about reporting on policy without reporting on the policy makers, and a little bit about the line I've heard you say in many times before, but certainly since this book has came out earlier this week, which is that you actually think there's too much punditry around.
Yeah,
Punditry.
So on the punditry point, I feel like I'm betraying my colleagues in the opinion journalism world, but I really do think that where journalism excels is not just stirring the pot, but is adding to the pot, and that in opinion journalism there has been a tendency over the last few decades to, both in print and in TV journalism, to have people kind of shout at each other and wave their fists and raise their voices, and it's been more heat than light. And I do think that we are most effective when we're in the lighting business more than the heating business, and that fundamentally it's that reporting that ends up having an impact and changing the world more than the volume of our arguments. I'm not sure the business model, though, is as effective. I think that people kind of want to get opinions that confirm their prejudices. And so I think there is a good business model for opinion journalism. But I think that where we do the most public service is by going out and reporting. And that's what I've tried to model. And I think maybe the most important reporting I did was perhaps about Darfur 20 years ago. And it wouldn't have done any good to be talking to the NSC or state because this was off their radar. And I'd heard some rumors about things happening. I went to eastern Chad on the Chad-Sudan border, and I found these people who had fled their villages. They reported family members massacred, bodies thrown into wells, women not only raped, but then ritually scarred so that everybody would know that they had been raped, to humiliate the group and to drive them away. And they were, it's an area that is very arid, so the only way to get water is in wells that are few and far apart. And the Janjaweed militia would stay by the wells, and if a man from one of these tribes that was targeted went to the well, he'd be shot. If a woman went to the well, she'd be raped. And so these families that I was interviewing, they were hiding out far from the wells, and they would have to send their young children, 9 or 10-year-old kids with donkeys, miles across the desert to the wells because the Janjaweed would often not bother these very young children. And their pain and stress and fear as they sent their children away and waited to see if they would come back, that just haunted me. And so I made what I had thought would be one trip, but then I kept going back and back and back. And that was the kind of thing where I could nag the NSC or the White House or nag the State Department, but fundamentally the information was to be found in Darfur and not in Washington.
I think it's been one of the most remarkable things about your reporting, and it comes through in the book, which is, journalists do not have the power to decide anything, fortunately, but you do have the power, and I think you've shown this better than almost anybody, to force things onto the agenda, whether it's Washington's agenda or the Gates Foundation's agenda or just readers' agenda. I mean, Nick's got a column that the Times has just posted today on Sudan that you should read, that is, an area that we're not thinking about very much right now while we're in the midst of both the Mideast crisis and Ukraine. And I think that's been one of the remarkable parts of this. We're going to go to questions in just a minute. So there is a microphone there. So if people got a question, you might begin to line up. I will just ask one ending question here, and then we'll go to yours. So let's think about where journalism's future is here now. We're seeing the huge diminishment, if not death, of local journalism. We've seen more local newspapers go out of business, and particularly in rural Oregon, you've got. And yet we're seeing some of the major papers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, all thriving to various degrees as they master the art of putting the journalism on everybody's phones and doing this on a global basis with a very different business model than the one that would work locally. What are you optimistic about for journalism, and what do you worry about?
So I worry a lot about the business model of journalism, and what we've seen in local communities around the country is just a catastrophe. And it's important to note that often this is happening in communities where there's no opposition party. It's a one-party community, and so there's no other oversight or accountability coming from anyone else once that local newspaper folds. It is true that at the national level, like right now, the New York Times does have a strong business model. It's also true that AI is hanging over the whole industry like a sword of Damocles, and we don't know what is going to happen with AI and how it will, affect our business model. But I think that is a real risk going forward. I would say that, though, what I find really encouraging is just, the bad journalism has rarely been worse, but good journalism is just astoundingly good today. And especially when I see people working on geolocating videos and doing all kinds of new things that I have no idea how they possibly do it, but bringing accountability in new forms, I'm really dazzled. And I'm likewise dazzled by the caliber of young people who are going into journalism school and want to be journalists and want to go, live in South Sudan in a tent and report on things there, even though they have no idea how they're going to be paid. So that I'm all encouraged by. I would never have said this 10 or 15 years ago, but I think that today I would now be open to having some kind of a government funding system for local community news organizations on the model of the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Science Foundation, because, if we have an NEA grant for a local theater troupe, that's great, but I think it's even more important that a community have a local news organization of some kind for accountability than that it have that theater troupe. But it's here be dragons in terms of where we're headed. And somehow I feel like, here's a book called Chasing Hope. And boy, we've been hopeful today, haven't we? I should just say that, there are all these challenges, whether in journalism. I think this year is an election test for the entire media landscape for the country. But one of the things that you learn from covering war and genocide and tragedy around the globe is that humans have an incredible capacity to screw up and do terrible things. They also have an incredible capacity to recover, to overcome these things. And that when tested, we are just an amazing species. So this year will be among those tests for that.
Great. Well, we're going to go to a few questions here, and I'm just going to ask each questioner to be crisp and actually ask a question. And start right here.
Your opening comment or story about the family in Oregon was actually an incredible segue from your Frank Bruni's discussion. How do you understand grievance, which is in his title? Local grievance, and sort of the essence of it locally, and then how it's been either manipulated or used legitimately as a way to discuss or understand the country's issues and direction?
So I think that Frank is absolutely right that grievance has been weaponized by all sides, and we see that in the news business with our emails coming in, and people want to propel a grievance forward and have us pounce on it. But I would also say, just in the context of my neighbors who died early, they feel overlooked and neglected by what they might call elites. And I am very sympathetic to that argument. I think that when we devised trade policy, I think we didn't think about or didn't understand the impact that would be had on factory towns around the country. And I think we thought, well, okay, the pie will grow and we'll divide it up, and we can make sure everybody does fine. But that is not what happened. And when people, I think we also maybe overstated the degree to which a job is about an income stream, and didn't understand the degree to which it's also about dignity and identity and a way of life. And Michael Sandel, says, the Harvard philosopher says that the last acceptable prejudice in America is toward the less educated. I think there is something to that. And I think that our policies and our cultural understanding have often condescended to working class Americans. I think that Trump has magnified that and led too many educated liberal Americans to dismiss every working class Trump voter as a racist and a bigot, which I think is both unfair and also makes it really hard to get those votes for people you're dismissing as a racist and bigot. So, healing those divides is incredibly difficult. There absolutely is grievance as one element of that, but the pain in communities, in working class communities around the country, is so real, so desperate. And, we do have tools in terms of especially improving education, and we've blown it. That was my 10-minute political career in Oregon was partly, aimed at trying to figure out what we do with folks like that.
So I've been a New York paper subscriber for decades, and you are two of my favorite writers. It's wonderful to see you both together. I was going to ask exactly the question that gentleman asked, the relationship between, well, anyway, but I'm going to ask you a completely different question based on something that you said. You talked about the fact that people who are victims also exaggerate. Now, I'm going to ask you about Gaza. Full disclosure, I think Netanyahu and his thugs are going to get all us Jews murdered. This creates anti-Semitism like nobody's business. But do you think the Gaza story has been exaggerated by people who, like me, who care about the Palestinians and think what Israel is doing is just awful?
I'm sure that there has been some exaggeration somewhere, but there is no doubt about the scale of the tragedy, both the scale of what happened on October 7th in Israel and about the scale of what has happened since then in Gaza. And this goes back a little to the grievance question, but I just too often hear from folks who say, well, it's terrible about this, but, or whose heart bleeds for Israeli kids, but not for Gaza kids, or vice versa. And, what we're seeing there is just an enormous tragedy, both in terms of, in the Gaza context, both in terms of the bombs dropping, but especially in terms of food being cut off.
Exactly.
And I've reported from Gaza many times before October 7th, and have been in touch with people there. And there's no doubt that there are an awful lot of people going hungry, and that we
are
complicit to some degree in the reasons that they are going hungry and in that destruction. And solving that is going to be a immensely challenging task, but I fear that with every additional bomb dropped and every additional kid who starves, it's going to be harder to pick up the pieces and take longer to try to figure out how one can get on some kind of a path forward I fear that it's going to get worse before it gets even worse in the Middle East.
Thank you. I get all kinds of pushback, and it's nice to know there's somebody on my side.
Congratulations, David, on the book. Congratulations, Nick, on the book, and your continued intellectual curiosity. Nick, Armenia. Will it survive? And if so, how will it thrive?
So one of the casualties of Ukraine and Gaza is that so many other crises around the world haven't gotten any attention. And that is partly on us in the journalism world, that we have limited attention spans, we have limited resources, and so we poured them into places like Ukraine and Gaza. And meanwhile, Ethiopia, for example, underwent a horrific series of crises which hundreds of thousands of people may have been killed. And then Armenia, as you say, Azerbaijan chose this moment, I think quite wisely, to go after Armenia and got very little attention and got away with it, with the sort of an ethnic cleansing of this area. And what happens next, I just don't know. I think there's a range of possibilities. I think that will depend partly on how robustly the U.S. speaks out and how much attention there is paid to it. So I won't wager a guess about what comes next, but it's a real crisis, and it's this broader problem of so many things happening in so many places that we just are not focused on. North Korea is another thing that I worry about.
And do you think that Americans are kind of shutting down on this? And we've seen some evidence, just watching reader patterns and all that, that there is sort of bad news anxiety that gets people to turn off.
I think there's something to that, and I think part of, in terms of global poverty and development-related issues, I think that we in the media, and I think the nonprofit humanitarian sector is somewhat to blame, and that's because our instinct is always to say how awful things are. And I think that just leaves people numb and thinking that it's hopeless. And so that's why when I write about these topics, I always try to note that, the number of children who die each year has plummeted. We're going to lose 1 million. The number of children who die in 2024 will be at 1 million fewer than the number of children who died in 2016. Tremendous progress in child mortality and disease, and I think we need to acknowledge that. It's not going to breed complacency, but rather to understand that we have the capacity to make a difference. We just need to try harder.
Great. We're down to, we've just got about 7 minutes left, so
I'll keep it short.
Just a few more questions.
So in 2009, 2010, you wrote a series of articles about sweatshops in Southeast Asia. And I remember reading them as a Westerner and just being completely perplexed that there could be a second opinion about sweatshops, something that differed from what we believed sweatshops were, a great evil. And those articles challenged me not just about sweatshops, but about my own understanding of truth, this universal truth that could not, accept anything else. Since then, our world has become increasingly more polarized. We've all become convinced that we are right, that there can be no second opinion about X, Y, and Z, and that nuance is a privilege. If you're too nuanced, it's because you've grown so complacent and comfortable in your whatever, that you don't get it. How do we get back to a place where intellectually and journalistically we accept the fact that being challenged about what we believe is true is not just right intellectually, but it's the way to go forward, and nuance is not the great evil, but something that we all need?
One of the great lessons you learn as a foreign correspondent is how often you're wrong. And just think, all the time you're in a foreign country, when I moved into Beijing, into the New York Times bureau chief apartment, so somebody pointed out where the bugs were, and I pried off the screen to look at the bugs, and I was so proud that I could read the Chinese characters on this electronic device, and it read electronic sound carrying device. So, just arrived in Beijing. I figured out where the bugs are. I read the Chinese characters. I got it all nailed. And my wife and I just figured, okay, we're going to now use this as our private disinformation channel to state security. We figured this out. And then just at that moment, somebody arrived at the front door, and we found out what an electronic sound carrying device is in Chinese. It's a doorbell buzzer. And just so many times in covering the world, it's a good way of learning one's own humility. And I deeply believe that that is an essential tool of journalists and, frankly, of citizens more broadly. But I also deeply believe that journalism should be invested in some kind of a sense of moral purpose, that we do have a cause larger than quarterly earnings. And there is something of a contradiction in those two, in acknowledging that one may be wrong, and yet also in being willing to take a moral position. And if you read my column, you know that I do indeed do that. And so the way I reconcile that contradiction, and it owes a little bit to my intellectual hero, Sir Isaiah Berlin, but it's to have the capacity to unflinchingly take a moral position, and yet acknowledge that that moral position may actually end up being proven wrong. And that somewhat uneasy compromise means that I think one is somewhat less likely to come across as self-righteous and sanctimonious and preachy. And none of those things ever actually help ever convince anybody of anything. So trying to reconcile that humility, yet with a sense of, with willingness to take a moral stance, I think that's the challenge for all of us, journalists or others.
Is it also possible that in ripping out the doorbell, you were simply in the wrong part of the apartment? I mean, my recollection of that jungle in my apartment was that there were these guys up on the top floor where the lights never went out because they had the tapes running all the time.
We were clearly being bugged. And in fact, one of our Chinese friends earned money by translating our conversations part-time. So we were bugged. I just had not found the bugs.
I remember when Nick and Cheryl went on home leave after Tiananmen, I was the one who came in, and they kindly gave me the apartment without telling me about the bugs. It was really nice.
Hi, thanks for the conversation. This is fascinating. My question has to do with the access that international news gathering organizations have to war zones today. And I just want to preface quickly with a book I read a couple years ago, You Don't Belong Here, by Elizabeth Becker, about the three
terrific book,
about the great book about the three women journalists who covered Vietnam. And the takeaway from that book, in addition to how amazing these women were, was journalists during the Vietnam War had unfettered access to Vietnam, and not just South Vietnam, but North Vietnam. They were all over Vietnam because the Pentagon didn't know what to do with all these journalists, jumping out of airplanes and stuff. So today, the governments or the war zones are managed. I mean, that's my impression. So anyway, my question is, what is today's access for international journalists to war zones?
So I think access has indeed gone down considerably for a whole bunch of reasons. One is that news organizations are less inclined to go send people off and cover the expense of sending somebody to, like, Tigray in Ethiopia. I mentioned several 100,000 people probably died in that conflict, got no coverage. Myanmar has a civil war right now. It's gotten very little coverage. And that's partly because news organizations now have a much better sense of the bottom line. They have metrics so they know exactly how many people read each story or watch every clip. And so they're less likely to send people. Another is that journalists are targets now in a way that they traditionally were not. It used to be that various militias or other groups kind of needed us. And so they would give us their statements and let us go along with them. Now we are great targets because we can be monetized. We can be kidnapped. and then people can get money for us. They can, do terrible things and put us on YouTube. And there's another reason that I think is relevant and maybe a better one, and that is that I think that news organizations are actually getting much more careful, appropriately, with reporter safety. And I look back and, I lost a number of friends, and I don't think we were careful enough in the way we operated. The book opens with this plane crash in Congo, and there was a certain recklessness to a lot of things that I did and other people did after the plane crash. So I think that news organizations have now become much more prudent, but the upshot is that it's indeed harder to get stories from these places. And I think that's a real loss for the public.
It's also bloody expensive that most news organizations
During the Iraq War, it cost the New York Times $10,000 anytime somebody went from the airport to the bureau in Baghdad. Every, a one-way, journey because of all the security, because of that was a dangerous way. You were at risk of getting attacked. $10,000 each time, but the New York Times had a real commitment to that story, even as audiences declined. And, it used to be we would just kind of wander off and make decisions. And I remember that it began to change during the Syrian civil war. And the New York Times sent two consultants with me when I was making a trip into Syria. And I was like rolling my eyes and, I can't do what I want. I want to get to Aleppo and they're going to restrain me. And one of the security consultants then forgot his passport. And I was like rolling my eyes even more. But, that it was shortly after that the kidnappings began in Syria. And I'm so glad that they had them and that they restrained me. And Cheryl is even more glad of that. So that has been a prudent, positive step forward.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I think you have now seen I think you've now seen why Nick is one of the most extraordinary journalists of our time. And it's been great fun to be along for the ride.
Thank you so much, David, for doing this. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.
So Nick has